Well, good morning, everyone. Please take your Bibles and flip back to Exodus chapter 32. All right, so this sermon is it's a continuation of last week's sermon, and I was trying to figure out how to start it, and so I just decided I'm just going to start it how I did last week. Okay, so we live in a world of broken promises and half-hearted commitments. And we see it all over the place. You see it in the world of athletics and academics and in people's careers, people in all those areas giving their less than full effort. We see it in the family, where spouses who make a commitment, a vow to one another, breaking those vows, breaking those commitments. We see it in politics, politicians making promises to us, over-promising and always under-delivering. But we don't just see these broken promises around us. We do the same thing as Christians. Religious people do the same thing. We make oaths, we make pledges, we swear that we're going to be faithful to God or to Jesus, and we fail in that. We break those commitments. We shrug off those commitments a lot of times. And what we are seeing in Exodus chapter 24 is that God is a faithful God who makes promises, and he always keeps them. And in Exodus chapter 24, and I know I've kind of gone back in my mind. We'll get back to 24, hang on. But in Exodus chapter 24, God confirms his covenant three ways. We talked about the first two ways last week. Through his word, he says, I'm going to keep a promise with you. I'm going to make a covenant with you. And then he confirms his covenant with his people through sacrifice. So I talked about those two last week. So go back and listen to last week's sermon if you missed that. That's where God confirms his covenant with his people through his word, through sacrifice. Today, what we want to look at is how God confirms his covenant with his people through his very presence being among them. Verse 1, so Exodus 32, when the people saw that Moses delayed in coming down from the mountain. What's the delay? What's the delay here? So the delay is, go back to Exodus 24, this covenantal renewal. And in Exodus 24, what has happened is God's people, all the Israelites, they're down at the foot of Mount Sinai, where they confirmed the covenant through the word and through sacrifice. And then Moses took 70 elders and Aaron and his sons halfway up the mountain. So you got Israel at the bottom, and you have Moses and 70 elders and Aaron and his sons midway up. And then Moses and Joshua, they get to go up into the cloud. So God's cloud, his presence has come to Mount Sinai. There was trumpets, there was lightning, there was fire. His voice came from the mountain. And what we're seeing in that gradation of Israel at the bottom, Moses and 70 elders in the middle, and then Moses, Joshua at the very top, is what you're seeing here is a vertical temple. A vertical temple. This is going to be clear as we go on, but I just want to make that note. This is a vertical temple. God's presence has come to Mount Sinai. He's there. And Israel has access to God's presence. The question, however, at Mount Sinai is, God, this is great. You are here in this vertical temple. Your presence is here with us. Are you going to go with us? Your presence is here right now at Mount Sinai. Is there a future for Mount Sinai? Will you be going with us? Will your presence go with us? And the answer is yes, indeed. The answer is the tabernacle, a mobile temple. So we're going to switch from a vertical temple to a mobile temple. This tabernacle. And what Moses is getting from Exodus 25 through 31, right up to 32, where we're going to be in a second, this is the delay. What he's getting is instructions. Moses is getting detailed instructions about the construction the consecration of this tabernacle. He's getting instructions about the fixtures, the furniture that's going to be in this tabernacle. He is getting instructions on the caretakers, the priests, and what they're going to wear and how they're going to consecrate themselves. So he's getting all these instructions from God up on the mountain. But what can we say about this tabernacle? We could say a lot. I'm just going to say three things about it, three quick things about the tabernacle. First thing I want to point out is it's back in chapter 25. Chapter 25, verse 8. God says, they are to make a sanctuary for me. This tabernacle is a sanctuary. That's the first note. It's a sanctuary. So what's sanctuary mean? So sometimes when we hear the word sanctuary, we think of like a safe place for animals. It's used sometimes that way in our culture, a safe place for humans to go, like a refugee place. It could be, that's what it could mean. We use that word sanctuary at church to kind of block off this space right here, right? This is the sanctuary. This is not the gym. This is not the foyer. This is the sanctuary that's set up for worship. And so that's what sanctuary has to do with. It's set apart from common area. A sanctuary is a special area, a sacred place, a holy place. So when God says make a sanctuary, he's saying this is a space that is set apart. It's holy. And so it's called a sanctuary, so it's a holy place. Later on, it's going to be called a dwelling place and then a meeting place. But what we're talking about in this tabernacle, when God calls it a sanctuary, it's set apart from every other space. This is holy space. This is where God is. So it's a sanctuary. I also want to note the structure of the tabernacle. And I have a picture of the tabernacle, so you can kind of get the structure. I'm not going to go into all the details of everything in the tabernacle, but what I want you to see is the gradation. You have the outer court, where you have the altar and the basin there in the outer court, that's where all Israel could go. All Israel could go to the outer court, and they could make sacrifice, and they could be cleansed for those sacrifices. All right, and then you have the holy place. As you're moving in towards the Holy of Holies, the holy place is where the priest could go. The priests who represent Israel, they could go in there, and there you have the lamp, you have the showbread, and you have the incense, the prayers being lifted up to God. And so only the priest could go in there, in the holy place. But then there's the Holy of Holies. And that's where God, his presence, that's where the ark was, and his presence was above the Ark of the Covenant. All right, so remember the gradation back at the Mount Sinai, where the people were at the foot of the mountain, and then 70 others could go halfway up, and then only Moses could go up into the cloud. What you have here is just a mobile representation of Mount Sinai. But I want you to see that structure, and the point is that Israel has access to God. I know that we kind of get stuck on the gradations, that only Israel could go in so far, only the priest could go in so far, and only the high priest in once a year. And we think, man, that doesn't seem fair. But the point is, Israel has access to God. God's presence is going with them. What's the significance, though, of this temple? The significance of this temple has to do with God's presence. And I'm going to talk about the significance of the temple in regards to Israel, but I want you to be thinking about it in regards to you as well, because kind of jumping ahead here, but the New Testament says that you are the temple of God. All right, so we're going to be talking about Israel, but I want you to be thinking about us as a church, you as a Christian as well. And so what's the significance of this temple, God's presence going with them? Well, the temple was where heaven and earth intersect. Heaven is God's presence. And his presence has come and it is dwelling, meeting with his people in this temple. And his presence is going with him, and this is what I want you to write down. God's presence is going with them as their true king. What does this symbolize? What does his presence in the tabernacle mean? What it means is he's going with them as their true king. Moses has acted like a prophet. He has a prophetic role to reveal the truth of God. He speaks the truth to God's people. His prophets reveal. Moses also is a priest. Priests restore man back to God. And so Moses is a prophet, he's a priest. He also, we're going to see, he acts like a judge as well. But who's the king of this kingdom of people? Who's the king? God is their king. And this has been the goal all along. I'm going to bring you out. You're not going to serve Pharaoh anymore. You're going to serve me as your king. I want to be your God. You're going to be my people. And so Moses fulfills those first two roles of prophet and priest, but God is their king. Think about this. So in Exodus chapter 24, Moses goes up into God's presence on the top of the mountain to get these instructions about how God's presence is going to go with him as a king. And up on the mountain, here's how it works. He's up there for 6 days in God's presence. And then on the seventh day, God speaks to him the instructions of the tabernacle. What does that remind you of? 6 days and then the seventh day. Creation, and it should. It should bring you back to creation, where in creation, God, as a king, speaks by his word, and by the power of his word, atoms and molecules come together and creation is created. And that's how God creates as a king. And then what does he do on the seventh day? He what? He rests. And I remember as, growing up thinking, okay, God must have been tired. As a kid, that's what I thought. He's tired. He must have needed some R&R, some relaxation, rest and relaxation, right? And I think sometimes we think that. Hey, he worked really hard for 6 days, so he needed a time to rest. He just needed to kick back and take a breath. Anybody else ever think that? Here's what's really happening on day 7 when he sits down to rest. What he's doing on day 7 is not sitting down for some rest and relaxation because he's exhausted. No, what God is doing on the 7th day is he is assuming his position as king and ruler and sovereign over all of his creation. He's sitting down on a throne on the 7th day. That's what he's doing. He's taking that spot. He's becoming sovereign over his creation. He doesn't just cease working. God did not cease working on the 7th day in the sense of he stopped creating, but now what he's doing is he's sovereignly providing for his creation. He's orchestrating creation. He's caring for what he created. That's what he's doing on the Sabbath. That's what he's doing on the 7th day. What that means for us, because we're supposed to remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. So what is Sabbath? What is the Sabbath for us? If God's presence is going with him as a true king and we're supposed to keep Sabbath. So even for us, I'm not so sure that Sabbath is just categorically means rest and relaxation, like just chilling out on the couch all day, don't do anything. What Sabbath means for us, and which, by the way, Jesus said the Sabbath was created for man. Why was it for us? What does the Sabbath help us remember? The Sabbath helps us remember not just that we need to take a day off, and we do need that, right? We need to come up for breath every once in a while. But Sabbath, biblically speaking, it's a way for us to declare our trust in the King. That even if I stop working for one day, God is going to take care of me. It helps me remember when I step back and I cease working and I just trust God, it helps me remember this: I'm not God. It helps me remember when I Sabbath, it helps me remember that, oh yeah, the sun came up today just like it did every other day because God is the one in control of history. He is the one working. And so when we stop and we pause all of our hard work, it helps us remember, like, oh yeah, I'm not God. I'm not the one in charge. He is, and I'm going to trust in him. That's what Sabbath is. It means that helps us remember we have nothing to worry about because he is the one in charge. All right, I think that's part of the significance of God going with them, but it's also the significance of God going with you as the temple of God. All right. So from chapter 25 through 31, Moses is getting these instructions. He's getting these instructions about God's ongoing presence with Israel. Is Mount Sinai going to go with Israel? The answer is yes. And what is Israel doing back down at the foot of the mountain? It's not so good. Okay, so here's how they should have responded. Let me get there. Chapter 32. Here's what they should have done. All right, they should have responded patiently. All right, 40 days is a long time, but it's not that long. All right, they should have just been patient. They should have just trusted and waited for those instructions. And so they should have been patient, and they should have been obedient. Why? They said they would be. They said and they promised to God, we will do whatever you say. We will build whatever you tell us to build. We are going to be obedient. They should have been obedient, but they weren't. How did they respond instead? They responded with idolatry. Idolatry. Here's what they did. They gathered against Aaron. My Bible says they gathered around him. That's the word that was read earlier. They gathered around him. Really what that word means is they gathered against him. What it means is they ganged up on him. They ganged up on Aaron in a threatening way. And after they do that, they reject Moses. They say, this fellow Moses, remember Moses? He's been gone for 40 days. Remember that fellow Moses? They've disregarded him. They've treated him abstractly, right? As soon as if you dehumanize someone and treat them kind of abstractly, you can vilify them and say about anything you want about them. We all know this pretty well. And so that's what they've done to Moses. Just remember that guy, that fella, Moses? They're moving past Moses like the Democrats are moving past Biden right now. It's time to move on. And that's what they're doing with Moses. It's time to move on. And so they demand from Aaron, come, make for us gods who will go before us. The Lord's taken too long. Give us other gods. And so what happens is Aaron takes gold, and he melts it down, and then they engrave and create a gold, it says calf, it's a bull. It's an idol. Here's what they say, verse 4. Okay, it says, he took the gold from them, fashioned it with an engraving tool, and he made it into an image of a calf. And then he said, Israel, these are your gods who brought you up from the land of Egypt. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of it, made an announcement. There's going to be a festival to the Lord tomorrow. Early the next morning, they arose, offered burnt offerings, presented fellowship offerings. The people sat down to eat and drink, and they got up to party. Those are rough verses to read. What's an idol? An idol is a graven image. All right, so we're talking something made out of wood, something made out of stone, maybe made out of metal. What that means, so the reason why I'm pointing that out is it means we're taking parts of creation, wood, metal, stone, forming it, engraving it, shaping it to look like a god. And in that idol, and those idols could be miniature, they could be life-size. But then what an idol is that graven image made by a man with creation material. It's put before other humans and said, hey, here, this is your God. This is your power. This is the strength that you need right here in this in this idol. And an idol is also, it's not recognizing and trusting in the Lord. So if you say this is your God, you've forgotten about the one true God, who, by the way, is the creator of the man who took the creation elements, wood, stone, metal, and formed the idol. God is the one who actually created both of those elements needed. All right, so that's what an idol is. But the idol represents power. They believe that these idols had power, divine power. My question, though, is this. I was thinking about this week. Where have all the idols gone? Where have you seen any lately? And I mean, maybe if you travel outside of the United States, you might find some idols, but where are all of the idols? Why don't you see any idols anymore? And I mean, wood, stone, metal, carved images representing gods. Why don't we see that anymore? Have you thought about that? So in the Old Testament, from chapter 32, really through the end of the Old Testament, idolatry is a big problem. The Jewish people, the Israelites, struggle with it. It is a major struggle for them. It is the reason why they end up in exile, the Babylonian exile. And so they struggled with it. And if you read Jeremiah that was the last book we read in our Bible reading plan was Jeremiah. Jeremiah, the very first part of Jeremiah, what he keeps saying is that your idolatry, Israel, is why you're going into exile, but he calls your idolatry adultery. Israel, you made a covenant to God, and you're cheating on him with these idols. And therefore, he's allowing you to go into exile. And it's in their exile where they seem to figure it out, like we need to get rid of these idols. So you get to the New Testament, and actually the Israelites, they're not struggling with idolatry. That doesn't seem to be their problem. But the Gentile world has idols everywhere. The Hellenized world with the Roman pantheon and the Greek gods, like there's temples everywhere. And people believed in these gods and believed in the powers that these gods represented. They would go to temple. You could go to temple, and what you would do at these temples is you would go to these temples because you believed in the power that they had, and there would be idols in these temples, and you would pray to these gods. You would try to placate these gods and make a sacrifice to hopefully get good from them instead of the ill that you might get from these gods. And so you would go and hope that you were worshiping the right way so that you were getting good things and not bad things from these gods. You would also maybe you would see like a friend who maybe you're fighting with. You'd see them go into a temple. Another thing you could do in these temples with these idols, you could buy a curse on your friend. And so if you saw your friend, maybe you're fighting with, you saw them go into a temple, you might need to go to temple as well to get some protection from the curse that you might be getting. And so you could go to these temples, you could buy curses, you could get bracelets, you could get anklets, and you could get different types of clothing to protect yourself from these powers. What I want you to see is that this even in the first century, the reason why there were idols and why there were these temples is because they believed there was power behind them. If they didn't believe there was power behind them, they wouldn't have gone. But they believed in these powers. They believed that there were powers behind the evil things that happen in the world and the powers behind the good things that happen in the world. And you got to go to temple to hopefully get that worked out right. So again, why are there no idols in America? Why don't you see idols anymore? Have you guys ever thought about this? This is something I think about. I think about it. Why aren't there any idols? I think there's two reasons. One, I think we live in a culture that just says God's dead. In 1966, Time magazine asked the question. Here it is. This is a historic cover on Time magazine. Is God dead? That was in 1966, and I think culturally the answer is basically yeah. We've moved on past the supernatural. We've moved past the supernatural. God, this idea of God, that was good for a while. That helped a lot of people in hard times. That was a good crutch for them. But as we've grown scientifically and rationally, we've moved past this idea of needing God. And so we've progressed past that. We don't believe in a transcendent God anymore, than supernatural powers anymore. As a culture, we've just decided God is dead. And so thinking about God, kind of this outside power informing us of what truth is, it's just kind of I think a lot of people in our culture think that's just a bygone age. We've progressed past it. I think another reason why we don't see idols today is because we think God is me. If there's no more supernatural God, then God's just become natural. You can find God in the trees. You can find God in the river. You can find God in creation. You can find God in me. And man in this idea becomes pretty good. We become we're okay. And actually, we're really good, and all we need is just a little inspiration, and we will do amazing things. We don't need salvation, right? Because there's no God anyway. There's no outside morality. We're just pretty good people ourselves, and since God is me, I just need some inspiration. I'll be able to figure this thing out. And if we just put our heads together, we will progress, and we will figure out the best things for humanity. And so I think those two things combine. And I think we have to admit as a church, sometimes we're culpable in this. We agree to some degree that, yeah, maybe God is dead. Maybe we question the supernatural. Maybe sometimes we do think I'm God. And when you combine those two things, I think you start getting why there's no idols. This God is me idea, I think, is real. It's so prevalent. I think it's why politicians all have a Messiah complex. Again, if there's no supernatural, and if the problem is just we can handle it, then of course a politician is going to be the one to stand up and say, I have the solution. I have the solution to our problems. I am a self-made man, and I have all the answers to these problems. The problem is that we kind of buy into it as well, and we start looking for those people to have some power to bring some solutions to these problems. But we look at it at a creation level. All right. Here's the point. Write this down. This is a theological truth that you need, and you need to know it. We become like what we worship. This is just true. God has created you this way. You are a reflective being. You are a mimicking being. You are going to become like the people you hang around. The older I get, the more I just become my dad. You guys laugh now, but just wait. You will become your parents, and there's nothing you can do about it. There's one author who said that you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. What this is getting at is like you take on characteristics of those that you're around. And you are going to take on the characteristics of the God that you worship. All right, so what happens when we worship self? You, as a human, become pretty weak. You become pretty small. You become pretty selfish. You, as a human, if you worship self, you become pretty self-seeking. If you just worship self, if we as humans just worship ourselves, we become fragmented. We become fighting people, right? Because if we're just here to worship ourselves, then what are we left with? I mean, it's kind of a funny thing to say nowadays. It's like we say, "Oh, it's my world. You're just living in it." Like that's what we end up with if you're just worshiping yourself. If there's no more like idols, and we're just worshiping ourself, you become your own God. And it's not, hear me, you're not a good God. You're not a good king. You can't do it. It's not a good choice. So I want to try to close with a couple of thoughts I want to talk about what is true worship? I want to try to end on a high note here. What is true worship? And then we'll talk about why it matters. So, okay, you become what you worship. You become like what you worship. So what's true worship? Let's try to get that figured out, and then we'll talk about why it's so important. Okay, what is true worship? Okay, I'm just going to rephrase for you the first 4 commandments. What's true worship? Okay, here's what true worship is. Okay, as you come in on Sunday mornings, what is true worship? What does it mean? First of all, it means you should have no other gods besides the Lord. All right, that's what true worship is. It means any other old god that you might have had, renounce it. Any other new god, any new ideologies, your culture is going to try to tell you God is dead and that you're just God, you don't need God. Okay, you got to renounce that junk, and you just have to believe in the one true God, have no other gods beside the Lord. Okay, so that's the first commandment. The second commandment that gives us insight on how to have true worship is we should have no graven images. We are not here to worship creation. God created a beautiful world, but creation is not God. God is transcendent. He's above creation, and we're here to worship God, who's a spirit, to worship Him. No graven images. The third commandment was not taking the Lord's name in vain. And I know this kind of gets reduced down into not using the Lord's name as a cuss word, and that's true. I don't think you should do that. I think that's wrong. But what this commandment has to do with taking the Lord's name in vain is it's taking the Lord's name, His authority over your life, and then not living it. You're taking His name and saying, He's my Lord, and you've taken it empty. It's vain. You've claimed it, but you're not actually living it. It's a putting your life where your mouth is. Don't claim God vainly. I think this is what that commandment is getting at. All right, so that's true worship, is actually putting your life where your mouth is. And then the fourth commandment was about recognizing the Sabbath. And again, we already talked about that. True worship is recognizing and taking a step back and remembering it's not just, right? It's not just R&R, but what it is remembering that God is in control even when I'm not. Oh yeah, I'm not God. You should probably take that away from the Sunday morning as you leave. What did I learn today? Oh yeah, I'm not God. Yeah. All right, so that's what true worship is, at least defined by the first 4 commandments. So if that's true worship, and what we worship, we become like what we worship, what happens when we worship God? If you worship the one true God, you will become like Him. And by the way, this is why you were created. You were created in the what? Image of God. You weren't created to be an idol. You were created in His image to reflect His glory up to Him in worship and praise, and to reflect His glory out to other people by the way that we live. So you're not an idol, you're an image bearer. Okay, here's God promised to Israel, He's promising to you that His presence is going to go with them. But what His presence is going to do as they worship Him, this has been the promise all along. It goes back to Exodus chapter 19, where He said, I'm going to make you into a kingdom of priests. I'm going to make you a holy nation. That's why I'm going to dwell with you. That's why I'm going to be your king, because I'm going to change you. I'm going to make you into a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. All right, so remember the tabernacle? You got Israel out in the outer courts, and they are represented to God by the priest. The priest of Israel represent Israel, and then you have God in the Holy of Holies. And what Israel was supposed to take away from that is, you, Israel, are a kingdom of priests. So what they had in the temple was a microcosm of what they were supposed to be to all of humanity. So let's just change that tabernacle around a little bit. That outer court represents all humanity. Israel's role was to be a kingdom of priests, to worship God, to know God, and to be a witness to him to all the nations. They have access to God, to be shaped and formed to be like God, so they can be a witness to God to all of humanity. It's not just that they have a priesthood, they are a kingdom of priests. We'll have to talk more about that next week. Because Peter picks up on that idea and he says, that's who you are. You are this kingdom of priests. Be a witness to the world. So the goal of the church, the goal of Israel, the goal of church was to reflect God's presence out into all of humanity. If we worship the one true God through Jesus Christ in the power of the Spirit, what will we become like? Here's what we would become like. We would become loving, patient, kind, gentle, self-sacrificing, a singular unit, a church of disciples. Doesn't the world need to see that? And that's why worship is so important. Why should you be committed to coming to church to worship? It's because worship is formative. It shapes you and forms you into the image of God so that you can be a witness to the nations. You could say it like this, because sometimes people say, we just need to get out there. We got to do this work. We got to get out there. We got to do missions, and we do need to get out there. We got to do missions, but you can't just get out there in your current state. You need to be shaped and formed in your heart of hearts to be a person who is on mission. So we could say it like this, if we don't worship, there won't be missions. Because the worship forms you, shapes you as you come in here. It shapes you to be a missional person. That's why this is so important. All right. Next week, we'll finish Exodus. We're going to see God's presence does come. So Pastor Leewood read the passage of the confirmation or the reconfirmation of the covenant. And God's presence will come and dwell in the tabernacle. So we're going to look at that. But then I'm going to make application out of the New Testament. We'll look at where Peter says that, hey, you, Christians, you are the temple of God. And we'll try to figure out what that means. But let's pray. Father, thank you so much for this morning. Father, thank you for sending us your presence. Thank you for being with us. We're not a vertical temple, not a mobile temple. We just are the temple. Everywhere we go, you're with us, and we're just so grateful for that. And Father, I pray that as we gather on Sunday mornings, as we're gathered here this very morning, that you would shape us and form us into what you want. And you want us to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, living as a witness, as a light in this world. And so I pray that you would help us to do that as your church. Father, I pray these things in your Son's name. Amen. Would you stand up on your feet with us? We're going to sing a song of response and invitation. If you need to make a decision public today, I'd be happy to meet with you. If you need to make your profession of faith in Christ public, if you need to make a public declaration of that, I'd be happy to receive you. If you need to be baptized, or if you're ready to join our church, if you feel God's calling you into ministry and your next step is just to make that public, I'm here to receive any of those decisions today. But let's sing and let's worship. And as we worship, be formed.